Philip Marsden, very warm welcome to the Digital Markets Research Hub. We start a new competition policy season, and it's an excellent opportunity for me to invite for a conversation you, whose work I admire so much. And it's a rare occasion that not only I admire your research and the way you present it, but also I share most of your normative positions. So, and I learn from you continuously. So it's a great opportunity to check if our clocks are well adjusted in this rapidly changing context. But also I cannot resist the temptation from thanking you again for producing this masterpiece, the concise history of competition law and policy of the 21st century in the form of rap. I encourage, recommend to all students to watch it. It's on your Twitter profile, on the profile description, so it's easily accessible. It is a genuine masterpiece. It's a description of all the main challenges and all of the main puzzles we confronted with. I keep watching and listening to it, and it's really a must.
Thank you very much. You're very kind, and I'm pleased that it hasn't got too dated. You know, I did it in 2019, and you know, if you're ever showing the students, just cut that bit because they might say, oh, it's 4 years old, but it's I think some of it may be still relevant.
It reflects the time very well, but the time is changing very quickly, and that's my first question is, you started this endeavor with the Furman Report, trying to offer some regulatory solution to long-standing challenges in traditional ex-post competition law and policy quite a while ago. Now we are in 23, 24, and thus I wanted to ask you, are the reforms in Europe and the UK going as you envisage? And what are the main new elements of the digital markets which maybe probably are missing, or maybe our rules are discretionary enough to capture all the new developments, so to say?
Sure, thank you. Well, I mean, we were honored when being selected by the Chancellor to be engaged and do the Furman Report. At the time, I have to say that we thought it would be somewhat influential, but perhaps not as influential as it's become. Mainly because we're, 5 academics in the cellar of the Treasury, working away, doing hearings. But despite Brexit, despite COVID, I've been so impressed with the government and the various teams that have come together from the various departments to produce the legislation. Of course, only digital is only part of it, but it's the bill, and when it goes through both levels of government, it's just so going to be so pleasing for me to see this. I don't think it's going to be changed radically, so it's actually, I think, quite quick. I mean, I think if I don't know if it'd been faster without COVID and Brexit, but I'm really pleased with the legislation. I do think it will work because in a way, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but in a way, the UK's, I think, is quite flexible. And by that, I don't mean discretion. If anything, I think this gives less discretion to some authorities and less discretion to companies. And we can talk about that. But because it's regulation, and regulation is supposed to be clear. So one of the things that the bill does is make certain things very clear. And I think that in the areas that are not clear will be interpreted, I hope, through guidance, through cases, through speeches, various aspects of the legislation working, the enforcement working. And so I don't view any of the vagueness there as a problem, but it will be litigated, I'm sure. And already the big firms and the law firms and economics consultancies are gearing up. But I welcome that, right? Because it's a living, breathing document, but we're in the world of regulation now, and alongside competition law.
Okay, let us start this with maybe a question on Furman Report, and then we'll look at the DMCC bill in more detail. So the Furman Report, one of the working titles of it was "Winner takes it all." Yeah, from a famous capture of the reality of the tipped markets, digital markets. And obviously, if we take this truism seriously, that this is a systemic feature of digital markets, then obviously the question is, what is the normative goal of the reform? Do we want, and there are, I see it as three most feasible scenarios. One, I just I connect with the vision of by Christina Kafara, who said, well, don't expect too much from this reform. We will have some fairness improvements here, some contestability improvements there, but it's not a paradigmatic change. It's kind of incremental evolution of regulatory, which is not bad, but don't be overambitious and don't put all your expectations into this kind of paradise new reality. That would be one solution. The second one is to make the largest companies to behave, to make them quasi-public utility. And you were among those who were very critical of this approach, because it essentially cements the status quo, assigning to them special status, making them de facto, monopolies, state monopolies, quasi, even if the ownership is different, but the status is similar. And the third one, to change the winner. So maybe there are others. So I wonder, what is the end goal of this ambitious project, regulatory project?
Sure. Well, let me just address your three options. I mean, Christina is right in some ways. I have great respect for her. I think these days she's more skeptical of regulation and thinks it will all be gamed by the big firms. Perhaps she's more in favor of like a US style approach, or sort of prosecutorial approach. I don't particularly like that approach, because while I have great respect for judges and great respect for the courts, they're usually only litigating sort of a few issues, right? It's quite binary. Whereas I feel that this is more of a sort of a competition policy, regulatory policy issue, and there are many, many, many aspects of anti-competitive conduct or structural problems that I feel, require a regulatory response. There's definitely not your third option, which is changing the winners. That's not something that government should be doing. And the middle option, in a way, making them behave, is part of it. Yes, it's a new rule, and it's like, changing the speed limit or something, or introducing a new law because there's been harm. So it's a bit like that, but I would choose a fourth option, which is the purpose for me, and this also results in a sort of a health check or a success check in a few years, is it's supposed to give some firms some breathing room, some oxygen, some ability to show their merits, and thrive on their merits, not thrive on the fact that a big platform has bought a reasonable or quite crap company and then tied it to the operating system or the search engine or whatever, and then by just force of network effects, force of size, they're able to leverage that product, which might not be the best, into a good place. And I don't think that's competition on the merits. So, my vote for winner takes it all, the title of the Furman Report, was based on, yes, the network effects point, yes. I don't believe that they should necessarily be essential monopolies or essential facilities like that. I think you do need to have room for competition to work and maybe unseat the winner. But indeed, also there's a reflection there of early competition law, to my mind, which is finis opus coronat. To the victor goes the crown. And by that, I go back to this point about merit, that if you've got a good product and you're marketing it well and it's one of the best, let's let it thrive. Let it have the oxygen, the sunlight. Let's not it be hidden out of a walled garden. And those are the kind of rhetorical points I make. So I would be looking for more diversity, more products that are coming in and out, more choice for consumers. Even if they choose to stay with one platform, maybe they could use another. And one of the big solutions in this regard is interoperability, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit. And so, of course, obviously, Winner Takes It All was an ABBA reference, and that's probably why it wasn't chosen. But the title of the Furman Report, it goes with this, right? Unlocking digital competition. You don't want a walled garden locked in. Everybody has to code for the same one or two tech giants systems. I want to be able to open it up a little bit more, and I think the UK in particular would benefit from economic diversity, more small businesses coming up, and testing things out. And if the large company continues to win, great. Maybe it wakes them up a little bit. Maybe it puts a little bit of heat on them to innovate a bit more, which is great. I don't mind who is the best innovator, but I don't want it to be based on well, I'm the biggest player, and therefore everything I push into my big product leverages that power.
Okay, and we will revert to this to these things of what should be the relationship between the enforcers and regulatees, also business users, end users, third parties with legitimate interest, government, etc. But I wanted to start this more focused part of the conversation when we have two regimes, underpinned by two very similar objectives. Maybe in some nuances they are different in terms of normative vision, but they look in the same direction. But they do it. We understand that if two chef cooks do same cuisine from identical ingredients, often the final product would be very different. And DMA on one hand and DMCC bill on the other hand are juristically two different products essentially, and thus we look forward to very exciting times for comparative legal research. And one of the aspects of this the difference is that, if I understand correctly, DMA is positioned as a new start. At least, it's a new regulation. We can see with what the enthusiasm with which the Commission in this explanatory stakeholder workshops tries to distance itself from the legacy of cases which somehow provided intellectual background to the DMA itself, saying that it's a new start, so to say. DMCC is more like a continuation of existing competition, and that's by when we have new start, you have a relatively short period of time not to be bound by mistake of the past or pitfalls of the past, but to generate your own mistakes, so to say. Do we have this in the UK? This opportunity? Are we still part of? Is DMCC still part of competition law and policy, and thus all the concepts, all the expectations will be linked to the previous cases, and thus we don't have this carte blanche, so to say, as a regulator, despite of all these generous powers delegated or assigned to the CMA.
Yeah. So I'm on the side that the DMA and the DMCC bill are pro-competitive ex-ante regulation. Of course, they can learn from decades of competition law with respect to some areas where things have been decided in certain ways with respect to structural presumptions or market definition or economic effects or per se approaches, object approaches. Of course, they can learn from this. But for me, I kind of regret that the European DMA cited in some of its areas as sort of explanations of why we needed certain provisions, that it actually relied on cases of the past, especially cases that had not been fully litigated in a way. So in a way, ironically, I kind of view the rationale and some of the background for the DMA in Europe as being, well, we won some of these cases, and it is a regulatory reset. There's no question, but it's kind of based on things that I think make it very easy to attack. That others could say, well, you lost some cases, or you don't like the way this case is going, and so we create a new regulation. Of course, that's not the only reason. I mean, for us, for the regulation, for us in Furman in the UK, I mean, there was a recognition that ex post law enforcement can take too long in this area, that authorities can be gamed. There's an information asymmetry. There are these network effects, etc. And therefore we needed a reset as well. So ironically, I view that while we'll in the UK draw on competition law concepts, it's definitely regulation, and the enforcers have to change and think of themselves as regulators. And fortunately, or not, whatever, we have a strong history of regulation based on competition law concepts, whether it's in telecoms or water or energy or competition itself. The Bank of England, where I have a role, has a secondary objective of competition. Of course, it's not a concurrent regulator, but you think about prudence, stability, and competition in a sense of ensuring that the best products are coming forward in financial services. And so in that area, I think that actually, while you'll be drawing on competition law, it's a reset, as you say. It's raising the bar. Hopefully, the obligations. While many lawyers say, "Oh, nothing's clear," blah blah blah, there's some clarity there, at least in terms of also the objectiveness of openness, of fairness, contestability, if you want to use that term. There's some things you can work with, and my only hope is that the authorities will issue papers, working papers. They used to do this at the Competition Commission in the UK back in the day, thought pieces, and then eventually guidance. I know the legal service anywhere would say you can't issue guidance until you've had some cases. Fair enough, but I hope the cases in the UK will be quicker, more agilely decided, if that's a word. And at the same time, this is not, all hidden like a ninja behind closed doors. You have openness, you have transparency, you have this participative antitrust, maybe open hearings to the extent that you can, all the parties in the room, so you don't just hear, one side from one company, another side from another company, these kind of mixed oral hearings, and then a relatively quick decision, and it's written up. And none of this, no grounds for action decisions, not written up. Where you write up your findings. We're using taxes to do this, right? And I want to be able to signal to industry where safe is and where the dangerous line is. And I think that's a responsible government obligation to do this, right? And so I am more confident about the UK regime. I feel we're coding for compliance and following the objectives. I don't feel it's a huge exercise of discretion to actually meet with the parties and have oral hearings and a quick decision and things like this. It has to be clarified based on the regulation itself. I do think that the European approach, while definitely, it's a big deal and a big reset, and the world will be looking at it, of course, probably more than the UK, but I think there's less opportunity for testing remedies. I think there's more of a reliance in the EU on fines, which will get big headlines in pink newspapers, focus the minds of some companies, and that's very good. But I don't really think fines, penalties like that, are what we would ideally like. Of course, we want the stick, but we also want, a bit of a carrot and a bit of a let's work together to find this solution. So I'm not as skeptical as people who think that the whole system will be gamed by the big firms. I think you need that reset, and I look forward to contributing in any way, because I'm going to keep pressing for guidance, for openness. None of this behind doors stuff, right? Because this is where the lawyers and the economists rightly complain. And I just think the CMA has a pretty good record of issuing clear decisions. You may not like them, you may appeal against them, whatever. But nevertheless, I think that is a really strong obligation on governments. And therefore, when I see some vagueness or something in a bill, I think, good, well, that'll be litigated and cleared up, or the head of whichever digital unit is working in this area will issue some statements in that regard to help us.
Okay, you have touched several very important issues. Which parts of the bill of the act will be justiciable? What would be the relationship? Is it compliance culture or more fine focused culture? And we will revert to this. But I wanted to start with this most nuanced conversation or more technical stuff with the question. If you look at it, obviously we didn't have in the UK the luxury to scrutinize the nuances of the bill itself. We discussed the ideas underpinning the visions, the plans, but not the bill itself. But if you look at the bill, which is a very complex and high-tech piece of jurisprudential craft, you can identify, imagining that defense bar is already, sitting and trying to measure which heuristic strategies will be invoked. You can identify several instances where the cases can be delayed. There are many public consultations, which is a must, of course. There are issues like, for example, when we designate at the level of designate, not at the level of assigning any obligation or conduct requirement, but at the level of designation. And the original version, at least, we have this requirement of entrenched market power. And in order to establish the entrenched, so the past market power, we have to conduct 5-year, i.e. eternity, forward-looking assessment of what would be the situation of the market. And I imagine if it's full merit review and these elements are justiciable, it would be a challenge, let's say. But maybe we will revert to this later. So my question is more general. Do you think the bill is well calibrated in terms of mitigating or omitting or avoiding these procedural delays which have been so skillfully invoked by big tech over the exposed actions in the past? And wouldn't be I remember the online platforms and digital market advertising market study, one of the submissions, I think drafted by Megan Gray, I'm not sure, but 100%, but one of the competitors to big tech, they was, okay, we know all of this, thank you for enlightening us, but start doing something, this kind of message. Do you think that the bill will enable doing things, or only to explore and further and trying to calibrate better our understanding of what's going on?
I agree. well, I run in Nike shoes and Hoka shoes, but Nike is Just Do It. I've been, pressing throughout these last few years for learning through cases, A/B testing for remedies, releasing remedies or tightening them up. And that's the kind of do it that I'm thinking about here. People may mock, participative antitrust, sitting in a room, chatting with big tech, blah, blah, blah. I think, there's a learning side for both. The regulated companies are going to have to learn about regulation, and the other side are going to have to learn about how do we do this. But they're not starting from scratch, right? Like the market studies from the CMA in these areas have been incredible. As you know, like you and like me, I've read the annexes to most of these things. Some of the annexes just set out beautifully the future of the regime, right? And those were just CMA studies, right? So there's been a lot of thinking. The team has been there in shadow form. There's big hiring going on. The budget is there. Not all answers will be ready, but at the same time, but in terms of, first of all, the pro-competitive interventions, which I'm most interested in, yeah, there will be litigation around the edges here and there, this and that, right? But this is the true entry of ex-ante pro-competitive regulation is, you're getting ahead of the problems, you're nipping them in the bud. So I'm most interested in the PCIs, right? The ex-post stuff, like that, you have behaved badly, now we go after you, blah, blah, blah. This, of course, will be subject to some degree of procedural delay. There may be all sorts of allegations of, we can't possibly give this evidence, or to your point about 5 years for looking ahead. I mean, obviously, this is easily defended by any tech firm. In 5 years, who knows what will happen, right? Who knows who will buy X, or knows who will invent what. So I've personally, obviously, made submissions, informally to the government saying, it should be 2 years. And this is the usual approach of competition authorities. The crystal ball can only go 2 years ahead and not 5. But even then, I think there are some areas where there's opportunities for delay, as there always is. That's why I hope the emphasis of the team, let's say 4/5 of the team in the CMA or wherever, is focusing on the PCIs, the pro-competitive interventions that reset the rules, and then and maybe a fifth plus legal service focus on the litigation. And it's their right to litigate any point they like. They can litigate designation, they can whatever they want to litigate. I don't mind, but I hope that litigation is done relatively quickly. And as you know, I feel very strongly that this should be under a judicial review standard rather than a full merits appeal. And so that again goes to our concern in the Furman Report. It was primarily driven by speed. Noticing the slowness of ex post enforcement, the binary nature of litigation, the adversarial nature of litigation. And so I think that when we get into this area of, some things have to be litigated, I just think that it makes sense that if you've got a set of institutional arrangements within the authority to bring a very engaged approach to the cases, agile remedies, they've been tested and retested in the future, et cetera, then I don't see the rationale for full merits review. And I know that I have lots of friends in various places, whether it's the CAT or whether it's big tech, who think I'm, far too harsh here, and I want an easy run. I want a referee who is blind, blah, blah, blah. No, I don't. I think judicial review is an extremely intense standard, and I think it's appropriate when there's been all of that background, the participative nature, the engagement, the well-written decisions, the testing. I don't see reopening everything into a sort of a binary point of view makes any sense at all. And in fact, I think that if it was full merits review, the legislation eventually would be relatively toothless in this area. And so that's why I'm a big fan of JR in this area. Now some people may say, oh, JR is a light touch and that's not enough and you're giving too much discretion to the authority. But no, if the authority has, and I trust it will, been transparent, open, very, very clear with what it's trying to do, its objectives, is issuing guidance, then yes, I think that is an appropriate standard.
Okay, let me just a clarificatory question. Judicial review versus full merit review. Which parts of the bill and what depth of scrutiny would be on the table in the first scenario and in the second scenario? Can you explain to us how deeply the bill would be referred to by the parties in case of full merits review, and how detailed would be the analysis in the first case scenario?
Okay, so I think that the whole selection should be under the JR judicial review standard, and I'm going to stay there until I hear anything to the contrary, and I haven't heard anything to the contrary that convinces me that would be an inadequate standard. A lot of people are out there saying, "Oh, you're giving the CMA too much power, too much discretion." They're trying to personalize it by talking about the chief executive of the CMA relating to certain mergers and things. But I do believe that if you have some form of internal panel system that is engaging with the parties, I could imagine it like, when you think about compliance and enforcement at the Financial Conduct Authority or other places, you have a compliance level that is engaging with the parties, and they may come up with a solution that's really helpful. Maybe you shift it over to enforcement again within the authority, but not as a prosecutorial approach. I sit on the Regulatory Decisions Committee at the Financial Conduct Authority and the Payment Systems Regulator, and also at the Bank of England. And this is an internal second set of eyes that the Competition and Markets Authority has a very great deal of experience with, even back to the days of the Competition Commission. And I feel that if you've gone through that whole system of review, then JR is an appropriate standard. It also holds the feet to the fire of the authorities, because if they haven't done this decision fairly, reasonably, properly, then they should be, it's the worst thing. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's the worst thing to issue a decision by the competition authority and have the competition appeal tribunal essentially send it back and say, whether we agree with you or not, you didn't do it properly. And I disagree with what happened in one of my cases in that regard, but it's a horrible feeling, right? It's not like we disagree with you. That's fine. I don't care. We win and we lose. But you didn't do your work properly. That's a nightmare. So I think it'll put the more of the emphasis on the authority, and I trust the authority, and I think that the competition authority in any jurisdiction, frankly, is peopled by people who really care, and they care about the policy objectives. And I just hope that there will be more openness or less reticence, perhaps by the legal staff within the authorities, to help issue guidance and decisions that are clarifying. And the reason why I'm not that keen about full merits review is I think then, like in the European approach, you're just pushing all the problems, big and small, but especially some small, boring, distracting problems. You're pushing it to Luxembourg, right? You're coding for infringement, you find an infringement, and then off you go. And that's the system we're in right now. So how would this regulation make it any better? So I still think JR is fine, not JR plus as some people have added. I think JR for everything. And okay, if it doesn't work, if you don't like it, if the cat complain after a few years or whatever, a democratically elected parliament can change that. And right now it's a democratically elected parliament that are considering this, and I ideally hope on a JR standard. And so this idea that I'll say it again, a democratically elected parliament, even if you disagree with a particular government at the time, this is an open discussion. This is not some, gift of a black box to the authority. Though it's very convenient for advisors to say that publicly to help their clients, raise perhaps human rights claims about this, and as you and I know, there's way more important human rights things going on in the world than this sort of nonsense. So yes, some things will be litigated. Some things I hope will be made clear. And obviously, there should be a right of appeal, but through a judicial review standard.
You mentioned in the beginning of answering this question, the Financial Conduct Authority, which you belong to. And we had a conversation with Martin Snoep some time ago, with head of the Dutch Competition Authority, who was very excited and enthusiastic in suggesting that we, in trying to regulate in competition in digital markets, have to dedicate attention to the mechanism of compliance as developed in this sector. Can you bring some light to how precisely it works there, and what lessons can we learn in our subfield?
I'll give you one example, and I have great respect for the head of the Dutch authority. I really like the fact, by the way, that in some cases you see a well-versed expert partner of a law firm or a leading economist, coming to head an authority. Very different world, like that for them from what they've done, but they bring that expertise, and I think that's really good to see. And it's not, poacher turned gatekeeper or any of these silly terms. It's, it's like somebody genuinely cares, right? And they know their stuff, right? So one of the things I'd say in terms of trying to answer your question is this idea that the authorities, as I've said, have this obligation to do this properly. My experience has been on these internal committees, whether it's the FCA or Bank of England or CMA indeed, that these internal committees are run to review the way things are going. Now, when people say, oh, the digital markets unit or whoever will become captured, because that's the way regulators are, they are captured by industry and the revolving door and all this. I haven't seen a lot of capture on the enforcement side. Okay, now you might be able to argue that a compliance level body within, say, the FCA or other authorities, because of its interaction with the regulated parties, is almost on a weekly or even daily basis, that they understand the market really well, and maybe they're less subject to capture, more subject to capture. But I could see that argument that you get a kind of a Stockholm syndrome or something, and you end up thinking, well, this regulatory tool is the best, or they might say this is as far as we can push them. The NHS has an internal body that tries to help with the pricing of pharmaceuticals, and it may be that they're understaffed, or they understand the pharmaceutical companies' say argument about innovation and why they need so much money for R&D, etc. So they may let certain things slide. But once the case has gone over to the enforcement body, so let's say we called it in the UK, there's a platform compliance unit, which is engaging with the PCIs, it's engaging with the initial questions about behavior, it's engaging with the regulated party. That's great. And I hope there would never be any capture or allegations of capture. But once you push it over the fence internally into enforcement, you're in a different game. I've seen this in every authority I've ever worked in. Once it goes to enforcement, you're not talking about capture. If anything, you might get a risk of it going the other way, which is confirmation bias. And that's why I think you need an internal check. Now, somebody may say, well, that internal panel could be an external panel, or I've heard people from the legal service and the European Commission saying, we can't do that. We can't have internal panels. Only the commissioner can decide, or only the council, whatever, the commissioners all together can decide. And I think this is just farcical. I mean, if you want something to work, you can change, not the treaty, but you can change certain institutional aspects. And we experimented with this in the CMA with case decision groups and with panels. And I think that's an important check on the case team, right? And so I've seen this working in various regulators, Ofgem, other bodies like that. And then there's other bodies that don't do this. So Ofcom, they don't have this internal panel. They rely on their own checks and balances. But I do think that an internal panel, hearings, these kinds of things will help with a better understanding of the problems, and then be reviewed on a JR standard. And so I think that it's easy to talk about how regulation can chill innovation and regulators are captured, blah blah blah. But I think if you have that internal check, compliance, and then an enforcement group, it's a very different group of people, a very different mindset. And I would hope you rely on that. Finally, and I get an objection once in a while to, well, financial services isn't as, it's historically been regulated industry. You don't even get into the market unless you're regulated. These companies, big tech companies, are not used to regulation. Well, first of all, they are. There's a degree of regulation. It's just not in this area, and on the other hand, so what? Okay, so they entered and they move fast and they break things. Well, I don't want that on the highway, right? I don't want that on the highway at all. So we give a speed limit, and these kinds of things are what I hope we're aiming for.
Indeed, this is quite convincing, and I'm sure we will have an opportunity to look at it a little bit more, additionally, when we will be talking about the relationship which we expect the DMU. Which is not in the text. I wanted to also apropos ask you: does it mean anything at all? That it's not explicitly mentioned, not as a statutory body mentioned in one of the governmental proposals. But coming back to the formula, which at first glance appears to be similar with the DMA, but in reality is not. We have in the DMA fairness and contestability. We can somehow, looking at obligations 5.7, see which one refers to fairness broadly, which one refers to contestability, or we can imagine another more proactive interpretation saying that fairness is about vertical relationship with business user, contestability is more, not only, but more about potential new horizontal entries. With DMCC, it looks at we have two autonomous enforcement regime, or two autonomous pathways, not dependent on each other. Unlike in one of the iterations of the reform, there were suggestions that the pro-competitive interventions will follow after the fairness-related or conduct requirements. In the bill, it's not the case. So we have two autonomous regimes. Can you reflect your views? Is it, or maybe is my description accurate, or maybe provide your description, and is it the best format we will have?
Well, when I think of the PCIs, the pro-competitive interventions, these will only be introduced with, a great deal of study, a great deal of engagement with the parties, these sorts of things, and they are sort of a regulatory reset. There's no question. And this is something where, indeed, you're trying to get ahead of problems, as we've spoken about, and therefore, when they're introducing these, I am hoping for a great deal of explanation and background and how they will work and those kinds of things. With the behavior points, which I would call the more litigious points or the more ex post points, like that you've broken a part of this regulation, and we feel that there's some degree of problem with this, and you may argue there are some countervailing benefits, whatever, but you're in a more of a like the traditional regulatory enforcement game, if you will. High stakes game. I agree. I'm not denying this. I'm not being lighthearted about all of this. It's a big deal, but you're in a bit of a more ex post game there, and in that sense, as I say, they might draw from existing case law. It might not just be case law in competition law. I mean, I'm a competition law person, but I have been interested in the past in trade areas. I'm interested increasingly in the review, for example, what we do at the Bank of England is we're also reviewing not just the entity, the defendant entity, but we're also looking at whether the senior directors, the senior managers of the entity have been listening and taking care of and fulfilling their regulatory obligations themselves, what it might be to do with integrity or something like that in the banking system. But I do look forward to closer scrutiny of what these senior people do. And maybe some nice ways of getting them to do the right thing through some form of personal liability regime. So it's that kind of refocusing that I quite like, and I think some regulators around the world are having increasing experience with this. I think we can learn from others abroad. It may be the case that the American Supreme Court has never cited a European judgment. I don't particularly care about this parochialism. They should when things make sense. Just as a comparison. But in studies and other areas of work, and even in the ex post area of enforcement, I think you're going to see people drawing. I hope you're going to see people drawing from actually a range of cases. A range of areas, not just competition law, but also other regulatory regimes. And I don't think that's inappropriate. I mean, we can litigate that if you like, but I think when you're dealing with these kinds of concepts of fairness or contestability or whatever you want to call it, openness, whether it's openness to get onto the platform and then fairness when you're on the platform, whatever these things, and the concepts are quite amorphous. Nevertheless, there's an obligation on the authorities to say what they think this means and to enforce it relatively quickly and not to get strung up with all of these other issues. So I'm hoping I'm answering part of your question, not just drowning you in words, but equally I hope that the authorities won't just be drowned in submissions, but they'll be saying, no, this is the kind of submission you have to make. This is the kind of time we're going to give you, and then we're going to go off and spend some weeks or whatever, writing our decision, whether it's about either area of PCIs, for example, making clarifications about what this intervention is, and at the same time on the ex post stuff, making it a relatively quick decision, because inherently it's based on regulation. So it's not the world of the rule of reason at all. It's not the world of massive discretion. And I think government would be pretty, I mean, they may not care about the CMA necessarily, but I don't know in the administrative levels, whether they care more about the Department of Work and Pensions than the CMA. I guess it all depends on budget. But I think given the new legislation and given the fact that it's got, bilateral support, I have a feeling that some politicians, in particular ones who've stuck their names to this bill or to the background of the bill, like John Penrose, they're going to be watching and saying, wait a minute, what are you doing? Why are you not doing something? They're going to be keeping asking the authority what's going on in this area, watching what the authority is doing there. They're not allowed to have any political input, obviously, with cases. But I think there's going to be a review there, and I welcome that. What have you been doing? How has it been working? Have you adhered to the political tenets in which we base this bill.
And this leads me perfectly to the question on dialogical competition policy. Yes, dialogues or multi-logs, which will have hope we will be able to distinguish signal from noise, as some people say. But one of the questions, one of the dimensions is, and I wanted to link it with the observation. You are a competition law person, exposed. You are regarded as one of us by the cluster of exposed competition cohort, and you have this inherent not idiosyncrasy, but kind of skepticism when competition, after abandoning its narrow scientific constraints of law and economics, price theory, we are moving to uncharted water, according to, or some people try to make it all interpretive, all inclusive, and thus adjust it to the needs of other policies. And there must be some limit. Of course, I'm not asking where the limits are, because it obviously depends on the situation, and it's too specific question. But I wanted to ask, what do you think the relationship should be? We are not we don't anymore pursue an axiomatic policy where the answers are discoverable through independent neutral science. It's a policy making, in a sense. So what should be the relationship with the government and with other policies? You mentioned John Penrose, but more institutionally, should we continue championing the CMA's independence? To what regard? Should it be at least informed of broader digital policy priorities, how and repercussion of specific decisions on our geo-economic interests, or it should still be a faux pas, a taboo, something which is rather should not blur the clarity of our policy making?
Look, I think behind any legislation, there's going to be a range of interests. People have voted for it for different reasons. Some people may say this legislation is a way of saving the UK from disappearing into the Atlantic post-Brexit. It's going to stimulate innovation and make us a world leader. Well, I hope so. That depends on how the regulation works and how the market works. That if it just entrenches existing power and you don't have increased interoperability, then I don't see what the difference would be. If anything, it might be worse. It might be still the life that we have now, which is extremely convenient products. We don't know whether something on my screen when I'm searching is the same as yours, very personalized monopolies, these kinds of things, extreme convenience, great efficiency, if you want to call it that, but perhaps things that are not innovative as they could be. So some people say to me when I say this, they say, well, you're falling into this fallacy, or this nirvana fallacy, that everything will be amazing, and why is everything amazing now? They'll say to me, and I say, well, everything it's pretty amazing right now, but we have a ton of complaints. We have a ton of evidence that there are business operators and business models that are not able to show their merit because unless they pay the fee. Or unless they, please the gatekeeper in some way, and then they might even be crushed by the gatekeeper. So the evidence is quite clear there that this is almost a natural incentive for these companies to do this kind of stuff, right? And that doesn't mean it's right. So from an ideological point of view, I wouldn't say this is about trade policy or industrial policy or even innovation policy. This is quite closely focused on sort of a I'll say it again, but ex ante pro-competitive intervention. And this kind of is obviously there's competition parts of it, but really it's more about entry than competition, right? If you open up a market a little bit through interoperability to the big platform, maybe nobody comes, But I don't care. If nobody comes, fine. If people are banging on the door and you say, well, we'll open the door a little bit and let you in, we're not saying we want 5 or 6 competitors. We're not saying we want 2 or 3. It's none of this ordoliberal stuff. It's more, we want to see what will thrive. And, I'm not going, I could speak forever, as about open banking, because I was involved in this at the CMA. But all we did was want to increase a little bit of interoperability in the system so that 7, 8, 9 banks who were all equally rubbish, basically, would feel a little bit of heat from the innovators, from the small businesses. And therefore, everybody would treat their customers better with new products, disintermediating some aspects of the product. So, I like this mortgage, but I don't like that for my loan or whatever. All of these things have worked. They particularly benefit people with phones, and that's the way the market is. Obviously, there's a group of people left behind. Hopefully, it's just a small triangle in that regard. But I think if anything, even the people left behind who don't use their phones a lot and can switch back and forth, at least they will benefit from the increased heat that is placed on the incumbent banks to improve their product. And at least in the technology area, I hope this will be a little bit extra heat on the back of the neck of the big players to say, oh, maybe we shouldn't just buy whatever we can buy and then load it into our system and it becomes successful. I hope instead it's like, hey, that's a really good product there. Maybe we will buy it, or let's maybe use it, or maybe users will switch. But I don't view switching or the size of companies, the number of companies as being the overall goal. I view diversity, as being an increased economic diversity. And one of my metaphors I might use for this is it would be extremely efficient if we only had like 3 seeds in the world, 3 grains, maybe even just 3 species, like that. But what rich economic diversity and biodiversity we would lose if we did that. So really, efficiency isn't my lodestar, my goal here. And this opens me, of course, up to criticism that, oh, you're going to harm efficient companies and you're going to only promote inefficient companies. No, I'm saying that innovation is clearly based in many ways on new entrants, new ideas, new thoughts, an interaction of diverse business models. It's not necessarily based on one company deciding that this should be the most innovative innovative update this year, and you have to use my update. This is the kind of thing. And I believe, of course, that's a faith of mine, but I believe there's some evidence behind it as well.
Thank you for passing this ball so elegantly to me, because I wanted to ask the question about Section 29, namely contravening benefits exemption, which is drafted in the original bill at least as a mandatory requirement. In other words, we have the situation, it concerns only the conduct requirements and doesn't concern pro-competition intervention in chapter 4 of the bill. But if you look at it verbally, or if you try to apply it strictly, the task of the defender or of the undertakings with strategic market status would be unbelievably easy, because pretty much any conduct is in one way or another beneficial to business users or to end users. It is efficient ipso facto because they are so good. So I'm trying to develop further your vision, which you were promoting for quite a long time, actually, that efficiency is a wrong standard to measure things. And thus, if we can justify your conduct, your hardcore cartel using 1013 or comparable provisions in UK competition law, if you can justify abusive conduct, at least informally, the task of justifying something which is so much interventionist, which you are expected to do based on much more interventionist vision, because DMCC is more invasive, let's say, than ex post competition law, would be incomparably easy. If anything, it could delay the procedure. So the question is, do we have to have it mandatory, or we can somehow phrase it in a way permitting the CMA to accept contravening benefit obligation, and thus giving them another bargaining chip in this dialogical communication, saying, okay, we might be willing to accept your explanation if you stop doing A, B, C, or start doing D, E, F, so to say. If it's obligatory, mandatory, would we? Is it the best formula?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, if you take one of the counterfactuals, the European Commission's approach, as you well know, is that there is no efficiency defense. And they've made it very clear that they did all the analysis in their various studies, and they worked out that certain conduct shouldn't have an efficiency defense. And some things are sort of more per se rules, and some are more sort of slightly rule of reason rules. But even in that, within their sort of focus on slightly rule of reason, there's not really a lot of focus on efficiencies. Now, I happen to be, as you know, a sort of a person who focuses on rivalry rather than efficiency. I think rivalry leads to innovation. I think rivalry leads to efficiency, leads to a range of different benefits. I would first of all particularly benefit if I was looking at a competition of seeing, several runners there of, different abilities, blah, blah, blah. But I'm not talking about the number. Every time somebody says to me, oh, you like rivalry, Philip, they think I'm talking about, well, we need to have 4 or 5 rivals. You know, and I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying I would watch a race with one person in it. Of course, I wouldn't. But sometimes people are competing against their past selves. You know, I mean, equally, I'm not saying, well, we have to have a race with 100 possible, you know, people in a 100-meter race. These kinds of things. So again, I'm not talking about sort of structural presumptions in that regard. Focus on numbers of rivals. I just that feeling of rivalry, that interaction. Okay, and so you know, when I saw the words in the DMCC about countervailing benefits, I said, oh my goodness, this is way too broad. This is a defendant's paradise. They're going to wipe the floor with us. Maybe it should. Well, first, it shouldn't be that wording, and it shouldn't be mandatory. And I thought, well, maybe then the countervailing benefits wording is okay because it puts an obligation on the authority to define what that means. And they might be innovative benefits, they might be benefits in some other area, they might be diversity of ecosystems, as long as they're not choosing winners. Okay. And then I pondered a little bit more and I said, well, you know, that's a very good point about that you make, obviously, about the voluntary regime or a permissive regime. And I think in a way, I probably would prefer sort of a permissive regime, because then you do really show, you still get the hearings, you still get the evidence as the digital markets unit, they get the evidence about what the benefits are, they will be drowned in this evidence. And they may be able to say, well, that's evidence about convenience, and we can see a customer benefit to that or a user benefit to that. But that with that convenience comes a cost, which is, we are calling the anti-competitive aspect of this. And you know, I don't really think convenience necessarily is something that that should outweigh anti-competitive effects. It's very convenient to run a cartel, but or to, you know, convenient to receive only, you know, a certain price all over the world. I mean, that's very convenient, right? It doesn't mean it's the most competitive. So what I think I would have probably preferred is that if you're going to use words like countervailing benefits, or you're going to words like fairness, then use another word that nobody agrees on: innovation. You know, so you know, show that we're trying to stop, you know, or we're trying to introduce pro-competitive interventions, the PCIs, but even in the other areas where we're looking at behavior, we've got the same sort of aim, which is entry, diversity, these kinds of things. And so I would hope that, to the extent that the provision is interpreted, maybe start out with we want to see some evidence of innovation over and above what we expect from entry innovation. And people might say that's too much of a hard standard. You know, we don't know what innovation would come from entry. And so that, you know, but definitely we have our innovation, you know, with Meta or whatever, you know, and I still go back to this idea I had, at least during the Furman work by myself, was I feel very strongly that the innovation levels, I don't know whether they're the most innovative. I have a feeling that if you're in a duopoly or a monopoly, you're not looking at the most innovative products. You're looking at very innovative products, but it could be better, you know. And so, you know, I think in a winner's take all situation, like we mentioned, you know, you're looking more at, like, do you want to watch a race with one player telling you I'm going to win and I win, or do you want to watch a race where there's some others behind them just you know, trying to show their own worth, you know, and that they themselves shouldn't be dependent on the large S or the charges, or the thumbs up and come on in of the big player. So I appreciate everything I've just said is completely, it would be a lawyer's dream to litigate against me, right? But on the other hand, I would love to litigate and say, this is what I'm thinking about, you
Me
know, and then
too.
you had that argument, right? And so it's not, so, you know, that those are my, you know, those would be my tips, is maybe we should be focusing on some sort of, initially at least, some sort of a, you know, the prime evidence in this regard to satisfy this commitment about countervailing benefits is it benefits to innovation in the UK ecosystem, those kinds of things, you know, and
Okay.
whether that's right or wrong, the judges will tell us.
Let me move. I know I'm mindful we're approaching the end of the hour, but if I may ask you maybe one of the last questions. If you look at it, kind of competition law and contract law, they are in kind of fundamental existential conflict. The freedom of contract on one hand, competition policy on the other hand, and we start with the most aggressive instances, cartels, then unilateral conduct, and then on the top of it, if we consider it competition policy in the broader sense of the term, we are more interventionist essentially. Do you think that that business users are entitled to the benefits which the regime is expected to deliver to them, or it's a broader public policy and the choices and the imperatives have to be coined by the broadest societal interests rather than particularistic interests of each specific business user to whom for whom the new regime opened so many opportunities. I refer to the kind of to the legitimacy of private enforcement. I know the legal side of the or I can imagine, but do you think that the regime was planned from Furman review perspective, at least through these lenses?
I think the best way to answer that from my personal perspective is, and I think maybe the others in the Furman review would agree with me, is opportunities. That word you just said, opportunities. You know, we're not trying to say that these small business users or whatever are entitled to have necessarily access to something else or whatever. I don't really like the comparison with essential facilities, and you say, well, I am entitled to this, and you know, I will assume there's a refusal to deal, blah blah blah. I don't really like that sort of analogy to this. I think that it's there, if they're entitled to anything, it's to an equality of opportunity. Now, what does that mean, right? Well, it's not an equality of ability. If you're no good, you're out of business, right? Or you're limited to a particular niche. But if you are particularly good, you should have the opportunity to show that without somebody else saying, not this year, or yeah, I'll buy you, or I'm worried about that, so let's just deprive them of oxygen, like that, so they don't win, like that. And we have famous emails in this regard, blah blah blah. But what I'm talking about there is that sense of opportunity, and I feel that companies who will come along and or already have been complainants, they may never be satisfied, right? But I think if you're able to turn to them and say, okay, we've given you interoperability, we've given you, sort of data portability, we've given you all sorts of new things. There's AI helping you out. These have all been invented, say, by the big player. We're not taking it away from them, but we're saying at a certain size, strategic market status, the game changes a little bit, like that. And because with great size, comes all sorts of damage, great power, responsibility, etc. And too bad. That's what you have to deal with. And I don't think that's unfair, and if no fantastic diversity comes up in a particular area, fine, like that. I don't care, like that. I'd like to see an opportunity for these to come around. And if a big platform can say plenty of opportunities, this is all you do, and then that is a nice disclosure, a discovery mechanism for the companies. It's probably not wholly accurate, but we get to learn more about these systems. So yes, we're learning to be regulators. We're learning to look at different evidence in different ways, probably less reliance on economics and law than on data expertise, these kinds of things, technical expertise. But there's always going to be room for the lawyers and economists, and I just don't think there's as much room with these new regimes for discretion. I think it's much more, this will be quite clear. This response will be quite clear. I hope. And there won't be a huge room for litigation about minor points, just the important ones.
Approaching the end of conversation, maybe I can combine two questions into one. First, do you think that the regime, obviously, we understand that in digital economy, 1 year lasts 3 months, and so with all this ChatGPT hype, that are we well prepared to address most of technological systemic problems related to monopolization and tipped market, or the markets develop much quicker than unprecedented speed with which the reforms have been introduced in both jurisdictions show? The first question. And the second question, obviously we have the same people who will be enforcing the rules, those who were enforcing ex post competition law, but this is a new regulatory regime requiring, probably, I imagine, different emphasis, different priorities, different specialisms, different understanding of the world, or different vision about competition policy. Which features in your view would be most would require most refinement or reconsideration in light of this newly changing reality?
Okay, well, let me use your second question first, and then we can talk about the first question, if you will, and I'll get you to remind me, if you will, about certain things. But the second question is, it is a new reality, and there are new areas that we have to, as I say, become regulators. I don't necessarily agree that the people who handle ex post cases at a competition authority will be handling all of the behavioral or ex post, issues in digital. I think there'll be a lot of learning in both ways. But I also do think, to go to your first question, that not that we missed a trick, but things do evolve, right? And so do policy responses. So I think that the UK regime is flexible enough, the proposed UK regime is flexible enough to handle issues that have been better identified by the German government and the Bundeskartellamt, this sort of ecosystem sort of issue that Yanis Lanos and others have written so well about. I hope it's flexible enough to handle that. This idea of leveraging from very very strong positions to in other markets and things more familiar in the German new legislation. The ideas of market investigation references that are spreading around the world following the UK regime and that in South Africa and others. But I think all those combined come to an approach where actually you're getting less discretion, less sort of focus on prosecutorial aspects, and more focus on understanding the markets. And then you understand how they work and then how to unlock them. If they're not locked, you don't bother unlocking them, like that. And so I'm thinking that that is the kind of approach where I hope our regime can handle that. If it can't, then there might have to be some sort of legislative change. But obviously since Furman and even since the beginnings of the DMA in Europe, the Germans have come up with a slightly different approach. I know it's based on competition law. They're very clear. This is not regulation, but they are looking at slightly different things than what we're looking at. And I don't think we should let that fall behind, this sort of ecosystem competition. As amorphous as that seems, I still think that's a relevant one. I personally think our regime can handle it, but it's not specifically mentioned in the bill. And if I was talking to my students, I'd be saying, don't necessarily get caught up in all the terms and the clauses. This is for the young associates at the law firms, etc. Stand back and think, what would make this easy? Like, how can I understand these broader points? Where are the vaguenesses? How would I outline an outcome? What outcomes are better? How would we test for that outcome? These are the things I would say also to the officials, and just sort of step back. Don't get too buried in the detail. That's for the lawyers, and they will present you with a lot of detail. But always keep in mind fundamentally what is the objective. And if the courts later tell you that objective is too amorphous and it's not enforceable or whatever, fine. Then we'll have to make it more clear. But I'm a big fan of just maybe just taking a step back once in a while, learning from other regulators. Not just staying in the competition law bubble, but learning from other regulators out there that have pro-competitive objectives. And how does this work? I don't think they're starting from scratch, though. And, as you know, I think the CMA and other authorities have been very clear what their objectives are, what the kind of mechanism they'll have. And I just hope that, they always remember that as well as I still think the pro-competitive interventions are the most important ones. When you get into this behavior exposed control, it nevertheless has to be very quick, I feel. It would benefit from levels of panels within the authority, so then it's less argument for full merits appeal, which just adds 4 years to the procedure or more, especially in Europe. And so I just close with that as sort of a recommendation that these things are hard. We do these things because they're hard. We're not starting with no experience at all. It's not just a brave new world, like some people say. We have some expertise, whether it's competition law or regulation, and let's have fun with it. By that I mean intellectual fun with it. It's hard, but let's remember that we have a democratically elected parliaments behind us saying, we'd like to give you these tools. It's not just us asking for these tools. We'd like to give you these tools and get on with it. And I hope that will be the model, and I hope they will be scrutinized closely. And I think everybody will. But I think that the regimes that are more bespoke, like the UK one, that involve more engagement with the parties and that do have an appropriate judicial review standard, I think those will be ones that other jurisdictions, other regulators, other lawyers, other tech firms might pay attention to. Yes, we're a small island off the French coast, and I wish we were still part of the EU, but I think we can still raise our heads proudly and say, we have a new regime, and we're going to do our absolute best to make sure it functions and awards that opportunity that so many business users and other users wish for.
Okay, last question. I'm a second-year student, law school student, facing a cacophony of different knowledge which I have to absorb, having zero time, but being attracted by this new emerging regime and trying to find my micro niche or my competitive advantage. Obviously, I have to do the musts. but in addition, maybe I could develop one or two features which would distinguish me from other second-year students who are doing similar thing. What would be your recommendation? Is there anything which you would suggest for our students to focus on, or it's just work harder, read more, life health, life work balance? This obvious recommendation, which are very important to know but very difficult to comply with, so to say. Is there any more than this?
Yeah, well, and I'm an old guy now, so I get to look back and go, crikey, I was almost neurotic as a student, getting caught up in the detail. When I did my PhD, I wanted it to be the originality requirement we have in the UK. I wanted it to be, it's the discovery of everything new, right? And I held myself to that, and that hurt, right? Because you finally realize you just got to write the thing up and add something to the mountain of literature you have already, right? So these things. So I often say to my students when they, well, first, come to my lectures, right? Like I remember some students in Bruges I wouldn't see them all year. They would read and read and read because they have no time to go to lectures. And then they would wonder why in the exam, I've noticed that they've just copy pasted stuff. Fine, they've written their answer, but they're just copy pasting. And I go, it's an open book exam. I'm not rewarding you for copy paste. I want to see how you think. And so I would say to second years or PhD students or anybody of any kind, allow yourself some space to think. Now, you might go for a run, you might go for a swim, you might have a nap. I like all of these things. I think the only good ideas I've ever had have been either on a run or after a nap. And this is very hard as a student. You're neurotic, everybody else is freaking out. And I'd say the same thing for their careers. I personally have chosen a path where I've done, three legs of the stool, whatever, academe, private practice, and government, sometimes all at the same time. And I think that really helps, So maybe some students would say, I'm leaving college, I've got debts, I need to go to a large law firm, and yeah, fine, you're going to learn a lot, you're going to work hard, you're going to be remunerated appropriately. Or I want to go to the commission or to the CMA and I want to learn and be part of these policy initiatives. By all means, go do it. That's closer to the academic world, right? Because you're thinking about the impact of policies. I don't feel that the current approach of competition law departments in most large firms is akin to academe. Maybe the barristerial aspect is, or maybe the European style of competition law with counsel, etc. But the other aspect of it is the academics like that. And I'm a simple academic like every other person. I tend more towards the pragmatic end. So if I have some great big idea, I want to think about, well, how on earth is that going to work? So Ruprecht Bodson and I wrote something, as you know, about, well, enforcement matters. How are we going to actually enforce the DMA or the DMCC? There's others who are complete blue sky thinkers. As you know, I love Eleanor Fox and her work. And the only time I disagree with Eleanor, for example, she might say, as with trade and competition a few years ago, we should have global standards. Well, my experience with global standards is you get the lowest common denominator and you get them reviewed by trade experts who only are focused on perhaps protecting countries' interests in different economic ways. So, I would say just don't wait for the global standards, get involved right away. Don't think this issue is going to go away, but make sure students or young lawyers, economists, this is a fantastic time, fantastic opportunity. Yes, you are deluged with reports and legislation, and competition law itself is changing all the time. But it's a great time. And yes, it's supposed to be difficult. That's why we like it. Otherwise, go do some other area of law or economics. Anti-dumping is not that difficult. Go do that. But recognize that you have a great contribution to make if you think about how things are. And also think in a bit of a pragmatic way, So the great scholars I've seen have thought of some big idea, and then they say, "No, this is how I think it would work." That's the second paper or whatever, because the government can't read, and nor understand every amorphous grand paper. But if you actually say, "Well, here's my submission based on my research," I think that's a really nice feeling. And I hope that, we had that with Furman, with the work. And at the same time, I think students should have that strength, that courage, especially as they get closer and closer, more specialized. I say to my doctoral students when they're nervous before an exam, I say, you are the world's expert in this subject. These three reviewers are just going to have to get you through that, but treat them as you're educating them. When you're standing there and these 3 or 4 or 5 grand people are looking at you, just recognize you're the world expert in your subject right now. And so think about that. It's very hard for them to do that, right, in the setting that they're in. And then think, I like difficult things, but what would this look like if I made it easy? Just as a starting point. And think outside the box. So that's the kind of advice I would give them. And in particular for the students, don't just think of yourself as I'm going to a law firm. Think about other things, other opportunities, or even a path through law firms, academe, and I know a PhD in law is a career limiting move. Myself, I felt this when I went back to a law firm. But it's not a career limiting move in other areas. And also, if you've got something in you where you really want to research something, go do it into the confines, the structure of a PhD. So I talk too long because I love my students. I love meeting them. I love talking to them about different issues. Yes, I'm the old man who just says, oh, don't say yes to everything. Just focus, have a nap, but go for a run. But I think there's a lot of pressure in these schools to work all the time. And frankly, a young associate at a law firm can grind out the answer. Yes, they can, but it might not be the most elegant answer. And I think that comes from taking back some time and saying, hey, I think I see now what the path is. I think I see what the professor is asking in this exam. I think should be the area that I should focus on for my own happiness and fulfillment. And I just try to encourage them to do that. And maybe not make all the mistakes I made with working hard at law firms for a while until I realized actually the contribution I want to make is actually a contribution, not just being paid to document the latest deal. So I've talked too long. I'm sorry I've gone over. Feel free to edit all this, but it's so much fun to talk to you about these subjects. And I know you and I are in similar areas. We may disagree on the margins, but on the other hand, the margin is where all the play is, right? That's where all the fun stuff is. So, I look forward to more conversations, and I loved your series. It's fantastic. I'm honored to have just one screen. Usually you have some more people here, but thank you very much for giving me all this time.
Philip, thank you very much for, I have to apologize. I will not be editing this part of the video. Philip Marsden, thank you very much indeed for sharing your brilliant ideas with all of us.
Thank you. All the best. Save Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.